Anyone who is interested in the historical person of Jesus will sooner or later have to study the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this part of the New Testament. Regardless of if you have just cultural interests, thinking I need to know something about the world's most influential person, or if you're a seeker and want to investigate who is this famous Jesus Christ, or if you are a Christian who really want to deepen your faith in Jesus, you have to go to the Gospels. Of course you can read something within the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian. He mentions Jesus in 2 different passages. You can study Tacitus, the Roman historian. He mentions Jesus in 1 passage. And of course you can read all the letters in the New Testament, especially by Paul. He talks a lot about Jesus, but he focuses mainly on Jesus' death and resurrection and the consequences of those events. But he did not follow Jesus during Jesus' public ministry. So anyone who is interested in Jesus for whatever reason needs to go to the Gospels. The Gospels, they are the main historical sources about Jesus. And they should be evaluated as other documents from antiquity. In this presentation, I will not be discussing concepts of revelation or inspiration or inerrancy. I will not treat these texts as the Word of God. That's a subject for a totally different lecture. I will just treat them as historical source documents coming from antiquity about a certain individual, Jesus from Nazareth. Because these are the key sources about Jesus. And that's not a Christian evaluation, that is a normal historical evaluation. These are the key sources about Jesus. You know, anytime we are asking a question, how can we come in contact with the past? You know, we are here 2014. Back in history, there lived a lot of interesting people, like the Emperor Nero. How can we know anything about Nero? Well, if somebody has written about him, we can know something about the Emperor Nero. Or Jesus of Nazareth. How can we know anything about a person from the 30s living in Galilee? Well, if someone wrote about him, we can know something. That's the way we can bridge the gap between now and antiquity. And happily, we have really interesting source material from people writing about Nero and about Jesus of Nazareth. And in terms of Jesus, it's the 4 Gospels. Now, I know we are here on a Bible school, and it's not that hard sell to convince you about the Gospels. But imagine that you were secular Swedish students, and I'm challenging you saying, oh, you want to know more about Jesus? Well, here's the source material. You should read the Gospels. Then I know what would happen. Immediately, 4 or 5 objections would come to the front. People would not be impressed when I say, oh, you should read the Gospels. No, they would say like this. So here's the first objection people in Sweden would have. The Gospels? That's part of the Bible. Yeah, it is. But that's not historical source documents. That's the Bible. Now, give me some real historical sources, and I'm prepared to read it, but I'm not interested in the Bible. Okay, that's a good objection. Now, let's do some thinking. It's true that if you buy a Bible today, you will find those 4 texts. but they were originally not written for the Bible. They are separate historical documents about the historical person of Jesus, written by 4 different authors, published at different times. It is a later process that Christians wanted to collect different texts and put them into a single book that we today call the Bible. But that does not change their status as source material from antiquity. Let me take an example. If you put together different Roman sources, so all the writings about Tacitus and Suetonius, and you put it together and publish a book called Primary Sources of Ancient Rome, does Tacitus lose his status as a source from antiquity? No, not at all. It does not change. The texts that someone else later put it together with some other material. Or take Josephus. You put all Josephus' writings together and publish the complete work of Josephus. It's still historical source of antiquity, one of the most important sources we have. So the fact that we today call this the Bible does not eliminate their status as historical source material about Jesus from Nazareth. So you have to study the Gospels, come on. But people say, okay, maybe you're right, but the Gospels are really religious. They talk a lot about God and the supernatural and signs and wonders and miracles. No, I'm not open to that. I would like to study some real historical documents, not this kind of religious stuff. Okay, good objection. And my response would be, what do you think about other source material before the Enlightenment? Do you think they make religious references or not? Now, you don't need to be an historian to answer that question. People before the Enlightenment believed in the supernatural, in God or gods, and a spiritual dimension. And therefore you will find religious references in all historical sources up to the Enlightenment. And that is not the reason to dismiss them. Josephus, he was a Jew. He believed in the God of Israel. He makes religious references. And it's a key source for our knowledge about antiquity. So that's not at all unique with the Gospels, that they talk about God and God intervening into our history. Of course, we do not need to accept blindly all those statements about God, but we cannot dismiss the source altogether just because it makes religious references. Let me quote you a very well-known historian and Jesus scholar, Ben Witherington. He says this: one thing that definitely distinguishes modern historiography from almost all forms of ancient historiography is that the ancients did not hesitate to include the divine or the supernatural in their narratives of historical events. So you will find that in all sources from antiquity, and including the Gospels. Let me give you an example. A key event in antiquity happened the 10th of January 49 before Christ. Julius Caesar stands at the river Rubicon with his soldiers. It's in the north of today's Italy. He knows that if he crosses the river, it means he's declaring war on Rome. And he's hesitating. He does not know if he should do it, because he and all his soldiers may be killed. On the other hand, they can take over Rome. And there are a number of sources from antiquity describing how Julius Caesar is hesitating. He does not know if he should do it. Suetonius, one of the Roman historians, who, by the way, mentions Jesus at one place, he describes the situation like this. As he, Julius Caesar, stood in doubt, this sign was given him. On a sudden there appeared hard by a being of wondrous stature and beauty who sat and played upon a reed. So he has a vision and he sees this being playing a flute. And when the vision ceased, Caesar said, "Take with the course which the signs of the gods and the false dealing of our foes point out. The die is cast." And he crosses the Rubicon and marches towards Rome. Because of a supernatural intervention, according to Suetonius. Now, of course, we have not to accept that the gods spoke to Caesar through this vision, but we cannot dismiss the whole story about Caesar at Rubicon just because there is this religious reference. It's the same with the Gospels. You don't have to accept from the beginning all the things that are said about God and the miracles. Because that's a lot of philosophical questions. If there is a God, and if God can intervene, and if God has intervened in Jesus Christ. But in relationship to the source documents, we can still read them as historical documents about Jesus of Nazareth, regardless of what we think about the supernatural. Like historians study Suetonius. Okay, but here is a key objection. Come on. These sources are written by his disciples, by his friends. They believed in him. They are so subjective. Give me some objective historical material and I'm ready to study it. But this is from believers. Okay, good. Good objection. Good objection. I also would like to have objective historical material. Can you give me an example of an objective historical document? Well, that is really difficult. If you start to think about it, all historical sources are subjective, written by one person instead of another, from one perspective instead from another perspective. There are no such things as objective historical material. Think of historians today who want to interview the last survivors of the Holocaust. And everyone knows in a few years there will be no persons living that survived the Holocaust. And historians are really interested in meeting with those people and interviewing them to get information. Now, are the survivors of the Holocaust, are they emotionally involved? Yeah. Do they have a certain perspective on the events? Yeah. Does that mean they are bad witnesses? No! They are the best witnesses because they were there. And that's why historians are so keen to interview them. Let me take an example from antiquity. This is a photo of Socrates, you know, the world-famous philosophers, 400 BC in Athens. He was a philosopher, a teacher. Students loved him. He did not give this kind of boring lectures that I do, point 1, point 2, point 3. He did never use PowerPoint. But he was using what we today call the Socratic method of asking questions and forcing his students to draw conclusions themselves, to start to sort out what is true and what is false. So he became really popular among students. But he also had a lot of enemies in the city of Athens, and they accused him of seducing the young people and of not honoring the gods of the city. So they sentenced him to death, and they gave him poison to drink. And he took the poison and drank it and died. Okay, how do we know this? This is a kind of school book knowledge I gave you about Socrates. How do we know that? He didn't write anything. We don't have one single word from Socrates. How do we know it? We know it from 4 different sources. There are 4 main sources about Socrates, his life and his teaching. The first source is Aristophanes, who was a contemporary comedy writer, and he writes about Socrates. And he has some criticism against Socrates. Then it's Plato, who during 8 years' time was the disciple of Socrates. And during a 50 years' time after Socrates' death, wrote about his master. And then it's Xenophon, who also was a student of Socrates and who was Socrates' friend. And 40 years after Socrates' death, he wrote 3 books about his teacher and friend Socrates. And then it's Aristotle, who was the student of Plato. So we are kind of 1 generation away from Socrates. 50 to 60 years after Socrates' death, he wrote about Socrates. Okay, here you have the 4 main sources. Historians tell us that 2 of these sources are especially important. And those are Plato. Because he was the disciple of Socrates. That means he knew him. He's a really interesting source. He has listened to him. He has followed him. And then it's Xenophon. He was his friend. And you know what I'm getting at. It's not a disadvantage to have sources from the disciples and friends of Jesus. That is the huge advantage. The information comes from people who knew him. Of course, we need to realize the fact that they believed in him, and they are writing from that perspective, that they were his disciples and they admired him, like Plato admired Socrates. But you know, the Gospels are very clear about the perspective. They are putting all the cards on the table. We are writing this because we want you also to believe in Jesus. Okay, good for me. Now I know from what kind of perspective they are writing, so I can relate to it. So, the strength of the Gospels are that they come from sources very close to Jesus. Okay, says the modern secular Swedish students. Okay, maybe I have to buy that. But still, I'm not convinced. It seems like these are kind of faith documents. I'm still not convinced they are historical documents. Isn't it faith documents? You who are believers in Jesus, you preach those texts. You pray those texts. You meditate over it. You publish it with a very strange kind of paper, very thin, and you have put gold on it. That's not like a historical source, is it? It seems to be some religious faith document. Okay. Interesting objection. And actually an objection I hear quite a lot from leaders within the church. During the 20th century, it was very popular amongst theologians, so Christian leaders, to say we must distinguish between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, whom the church proclaimed in the Gospels. So the thought then is, back in the 30s, you have Jesus of Nazareth. And then a number of decades later, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you have Christians preaching and proclaiming. And a lot of things has happened in between. So there's not much connection any longer between the Jesus of the 30s and the proclamation of the church in the 80s or 90s. They have added a lot of things. So, a number of theologians have said, actually there's a lot of myth and legend within the Gospels. Things that is not true in the relationship to the 30s, but Christians added stories and perspectives to the Gospels. This is a very serious objection. It's of course very interesting to have access to the sermons of people in the 80s or 90s, but it's much more interesting if we could have information about the Jesus of the 30s, isn't it? And that's what I'm interested, not in what the church preached, but who was the real Jesus. And this perspective seems to say we can't have access to the real Jesus. Now, people who were experts in literature, they have never accepted this view. That's the first thing I want to say. C.S. Lewis, who we know mainly as a Christian apologist maybe, or a writer of children's literature in the Narnia, he was a world-leading expert in literature, professor in Cambridge and Oxford. And he was never convinced about this idea. He said, I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this, like the Gospels. So he said, it's not myth and legend. This is history. I find that interesting. He was an expert in literature. I recently read a very interesting biography by a contemporary expert in literature. Her name is Holly Ordway. She's an academic specializing in literature. And she tells her story to the Christian faith. As an adult, she became a Christian. And she tells her story. And then she says this. I read through the gospel narratives again, trying to take in what they said. I had to admit that, even apart from everything else I had learned, I recognized that they were fact, not story. I'd been steeped in folklore, fantasy, legend and myth ever since I was a child, and I had studied this literary genre as an adult. I knew their cadences, their flavor, their rhythm. None of these stylistic fingerprints appeared in the New Testament books that I was reading. The gospel had the ineffable texture of history, with all the odd clarity of detail that comes when the author is recounting something so huge that even as he tells it, he doesn't see all the implications. So here you have a contemporary expert in literature saying, it is not myth and legend, it's history. Now, I have some good news. What the experts in literature have said all the time, finally the theologians have discovered. There's been actually a revolution amongst New Testament scholars in what they say about the gospel genre. It is mainly through the research of Richard Burridge, who had made a very impressive research project where he has compared the Gospels with the genre of Greco-Roman biographies. That was a specific genre in antiquity, the writing of biographies, where you are describing an individual person's life. And he has very convincingly shown that the Gospel is a part of the Greco-Roman biography genre. And he says at the end of his book, the identification of the gospel genre as a type of Greco-Roman biography has now become the consensus. That's the majority view. That's something that everyone is agreed upon. That the new has become the consensus among New Testament scholars. So, what we have in the Gospels is not the sermons of the 70s or 80s or 90s. It's the history of the 30s. It's not a faith document. It wants to that you and I and others should come to faith, But the Younger is not a faith document. It is a historical source about an individual in antiquity, Jesus from Nazareth. His public life, his teaching, his death, and what happens after his crucifixion. Okay, a last objection. But still, I'm not convinced that I should read the Gospels. Aren't they books filled with contradictions? Well, if I'm asked that by a Swedish student, I usually ask a question back. Can you give an example of a contradiction? I know it's a little bit evil to do that because they don't know. They've just heard from somewhere that the Gospels are filled with contradictions. But of course, this is an interesting question. Are the source documents about Jesus filled with contradictions? And my answer would be, no, that's not a basic feature of the Gospels. They tell a very coherent story. They have the same basic outline. They describe the same kind of person, the same teaching he gave, and the same basic outline of his life. So there's not a lot of big contradictions. But there are some details at some places that you can ask the question, oh, how does this fit together? But it's always on the level of the details, not in the main story. And interestingly, the same feature you can find in all sources from antiquity. You read Josephus, and there are these kinds of inconsistencies and apparent contradictions. Or you read Tacitus, and you can have the same kind of question. Let me give you an example. One of the big events in the Roman Empire took place the 19th of July, the year 64. The capital of the empire was burnt down. A huge part of Rome was under fire and destroyed. It was a horrendous event. And if you're a tourist in Rome today, the guides will show you how the city was changed because of that fire. Now we know about the fire not only from excavations in Rome where we can see how the city was changed and new things were built because of the fire, but we have three different sources. Tacitus writes about it 50 years after the event. Suetonius writes about it 50 years after the event, and Cassius Dio, which is a much later historian, writes about it 150 years after the event. And of course they have the same basic outline. They are telling about the fire in Rome. But they do not agree on the details. So they give us different information about where Nero was when the fire started. Tacitus says he was in Antium, which is a city 50 kilometers south of Rome. Suetonius says no, he was at Escalinen, which is one of the 7 hills around Rome. And Cassius Dio says he was at Palatinum, which is another of the 7 hills around Rome. So, where were we? We don't know. The sources contradict each other in this detail. So what do historians do? No, they don't dismiss everything in the source. They just acknowledge, okay, here's some uncertainties about the location of Nero, the emperor. But we can still have information about the fire of Rome from those sources. And I could give you a number of other examples where the sources differ in terms of details. But that in itself is not the reason to dismiss the source as an historical source. It's the same with the gospel narratives. You can find things that looks like a contradiction, or at least gives us questions how to understand this. Historians also, of course, raises the question, maybe one or two of the sources are giving us an error. They are wrong. But another alternative we also need to discuss is, of course, what is the definition of when did the fire start? Because a city is not put on fire within 1 second. It takes some time from the first flame until it's a big fire, so everyone says, wow, there is a fire in the city. It takes time before you have that kind of big fire. So how do these authors define the starting point of the fire? Is it the first flame, or is it 1 hour later when everyone can realize that this is really going to burn down Rome? So maybe 2 of the sources can be right at the same time, because Nero was, when the first flame came up, at Palatinen, and when the city really was on fire, he was at Escalinen. We don't know. So we need to be a little bit humble in relationship to the ancient sources and say, we don't have the full picture yet. Mike Licona is an American New Testament scholar, a very gifted apologist. He has a website with a lot of interesting material on the Gospels and on the historical Jesus and on the resurrection of Jesus. I warmly recommend his work. And he has done quite a remarkable work in terms of the whole issue of contradictions within ancient sources. He has started to study the biographies of Plutarch. Plutarch is a person who wrote a huge number of biographies of famous persons in antiquity. 50 of those biographies have survived, so we still can read them. And Mike Licona has started to compare the different biographies of Plutarch. And I quote from some of his writing here, Mike Licona. So you have the same biographer telling the same story 5 different times. And this is about the assassination of Caesar. By noticing how Plutarch tells the story of Caesar's assassination differently, we can notice the kinds of biographical liberties that Plutarch took. And he's writing around the same time that some of the Gospels are being written, and in the same language, that is Greek. As I started to note some of these liberties that he took, I immediately started recognizing these are the same liberties that I noticed that the evangelists take, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If this is the case, then these most commonly cited differences in the Gospels aren't contradictions after all. They are just the standard biographical liberties that ancient biographers of that day took. So the same phenomenon that we can find in the Gospels and that we often call contradictions, you can find within Plutarch's writing. And they are actually not contradictions. That are just expressions of the liberty an author has to arrange his material differently, to choose how much you tell and how much you choose to not tell at a certain time. It's just a question of the author's liberty. Okay, I've tried to answer the 5 most common objections I meet from non-Christians who are trying to avoid to study the Gospels. And I would say none of them are really good objections. You have to study the Gospels. There are no good reasons not to do it. Now, this has been an exercise in a kind of negative apologetics, answering objections, answering criticism. And I've tried to show there is not much force within those objections. We can answer them, I think, in quite a good way. But we can do more than negative apologetics. We can also do a positive apologetics, giving positive arguments for the historical reliability of the Gospels. And let me give you at least an introduction to some of those areas. So how would I argue positively for the historical reliability of the Gospels? In my book, I go through 8 different lines of evidences. We will not have the time to do that here, but I will give you 2 or 3 lines of evidences, and then we can have a discussion. Let me begin with the date of the Gospels. When were those texts written? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus' public ministry is around 30 AD. The Gospels, all 4 of them, are first century documents. We cannot date them with any precision. We cannot say which year with any certainty. The standard view among scholars is that the Gospels were written from the 60s, with Mark being the first one, and then Matthew and Luke in the 80s and 90s, and John in the 90s. The key thing here is that they are all first century documents. It means they were written when the eyewitness generation were still alive. And it actually does not matter that we cannot date them with an exact precision. If there is a trend within New Testament scholarship, it is a trend to date them even earlier. And you can give a good argument for the Gospels, the first Gospel being written already in the 50s. And actually you can find scholars saying that the Gospel of Mark was written already in the 40s. An atheist New Testament scholar in England has recently made his PhD on an early dating of the Gospel of Mark. So the trend is to date them even earlier. I will, in my presentation here, just run with what is the dominant view, that the Gospels were written from the 60s until the 90s. So then you have a 30-year gap between the events and the source, the earliest source. And that is a very short time. I know it sounds strange to some of you, but I remember what happened 30 years ago. I was there. It's not a long time. And this puts the Gospels in a very unique position. You, for example, read the Gnostic Gospels. If you have read Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, you know he tries to hype the Gnostic Gospels. They are much, much, much later writings. They are written between 150 and 350 AD and have no contact with the eyewitness generation or the real events. And they are not historical sources about Jesus. They are historical sources about Gnosticism, about the thinking within the Gnostic movement. Compare this with other sources from antiquity. So we have a 30-year gap between Jesus and the first gospel. Now, Alexander the Great, the best source is Plutarch. He's writing 400 years after the event. That's a huge difference, isn't it? 30 years or 400. Or you take the Roman emperors. The best sources are Tacitus and Suetonius, and they are writing about some of their contemporary Roman emperors, but about a number of the emperors, there is 100 years time difference. And there's only 30 between Jesus and the oldest gospel. So we are in a very good position to have early sources, just 30 years after the events, and maybe even a shorter time if some of the other datings are true. Maybe it's down to 20 years. But anyhow, that's a very good situation for an event in antiquity. Secondly, what was the prehistory of the Gospels during those 30 years? And I know a lot of us Christians, we are really disturbed by this. Why on earth did I wait 30 years? Why didn't they write it 2 weeks after Pentecost? What were they thinking about? It would feel so much better if we could date the Gospels in the 30s, wouldn't it? So we have to deal with a prehistory of 2 or 3 decades. Now, we need to do some thinking here. It's not at all strange that they waited for some decades. Why? For a very easy reason. Historians says that 90% of the inhabitants in the Roman Empire were illiterate. They couldn't read. It was different among the Jewish population, but in the empire as a whole, up to 90% were illiterate. They couldn't read. Now, imagine yourself in a situation. You have a burning message. You want to reach the world. And 90% of the people are illiterate. They cannot read. What is the first thing you want to do? Oh, I have to write it down. No. That's not a meaningful thought. You want to proclaim it. And that's how all information in the Roman Empire was spread. That's how the emperor did it. He sent messengers coming to a city, announcing news from the emperor. That's how you spread information. So it's not strange that the first Christians were focusing on witnessing and preaching and proclaiming and arguing. It's totally natural. And remember, they had no printing press. So if they write down something, you had one copy at one place. That's it. And you want to reach the world. Of course they were sending out people preaching. But then people say, like Richard Dawkins, but this is really problematic. You have 20 or 30 years where it's a verbal transmission of the message. It's like playing the telephone game. So I whisper something in Henrik's ears, and then you know the telephone game, and then you are saying out loud. And the message is totally different. And that would be within 2 minutes of 80 people. Think about 3 decades and thousands of people. So the objection is, if you have verbal transmission for several decades, the message will be totally changed. Nothing will be left of the original thing. Okay, this is a clever illustration. Richard Dawkins is very clever. But think about it. Is this a good analogy? Okay, let's think about the telephone game. Why is the message changed when we are playing the telephone game? Because we are whispering. We don't hear what the other person say. That's the reason, isn't it? And then we have 2 special rules. You are not allowed to say, sorry, I didn't hear, what did you say? And second, so it cannot be repeated. And secondly, you are forced to whisper something in the next person's ear. And if you did not hear, you have to just say something you invent yourself. That's why the message is changed. You know, the first Christians were not whispering in the Roman Empire, Jesus is Lord. What did you say? No, I will not repeat it. It's a really stupid analogy, isn't it? This is not the way it was transmitted. Now, it was transmitted in a culture where people were trained in keeping content and transmitting it verbally. Education was focused on learning things by heart because people did not have books. And it was a very high value put upon people who could learn and keep things intact, keep knowledge intact. Writers in antiquity often brag about how much they know by heart and how quickly they can learn it. Most of us have totally lost the ability to learn things by heart. But think of it, we have some in our culture who can. Think of actors who are standing 3 hours every night on a stage saying the exact same script. I have actually listened to an actor playing out the Gospel of Mark. Exactly. The full Gospel, telling it and acting it out himself for several hours. He knows the Gospel of Mark by heart. And you can do that if you just learn the right techniques. Like if you have Muslim friends, some of them knows the whole Quran by heart. So you can learn huge amount of knowledge by heart. When Luke is telling how he wrote his gospel, he's saying this. And this is from the introduction of the Gospel of Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those whose from the very first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilos, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So, Luke was not an eyewitness himself, but he has interviewed eyewitnesses, and not any eyewitness, but those eyewitnesses who was there from the very first, who was part of Jesus' ministry from the beginning to the end, and who were then the officially, those who were the servants of the word, who officially proclaimed the message. So he has his information from those who knew Jesus and had learned Jesus' teaching and were now proclaiming it. You can say it like this. There were controlling factors during those 2 or 3 decades of verbal transmission. So it was a verbal transmission in a culture with very strict rules for verbal transmission, especially within the Jewish culture, where a disciple was obliged to learn the rabbi's teaching. Secondly, the original eyewitnesses were part of the whole process, were following the whole process, and could protest if those who wrote it down was not faithful to the original message. And thirdly, we should not dismiss the possibility of written notes already from the beginning. We can be absolutely sure, I think, that one of the disciples of Jesus could write. I don't know if you can guess of who I'm thinking of. What? Sorry? Yes, absolutely Matthew, because he was a tax collector who had to give an account before Herod Antipas every week or every month. This is how much tax and toll I've taken up, and he should give the majority to Herod Antipas and then keep some percentage for himself and for his employees. And that has always been written accounts. So he had been writing every day of his adult life before he became an disciple of Jesus. So it's fully natural if he continued that habit, and instead of writing down finances, he wrote down the teaching of Jesus. So there's actually among the scholars a new discussion about the possibility of very early written notes. Thirdly, the eyewitnesses' content of the Gospels. I quoted Luke, who said he interviewed eyewitnesses. It's interesting to see that the historians of antiquity, they were discussing what is a good historical account. And one of the most famous historian, Heraclitus, he says, eyes are better than ears. We need to work out from this principle. Eyes are better than ears. This means you should come in contact with eyewitnesses. You need to talk to someone who was there and saw it. Not hear from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone that this happened. What comes through that chain is not at all as reliable as if you talk to someone who saw it. Exactly how modern day journalists are working. Some catastrophe is happening. Then they're looking for someone who was there, an eyewitness to interview, so they can have reliable information. Now, they knew this in antiquity. It's not a new discovery. They are discussing it. We need to base our historical sources on eyewitnesses. Now, may I quote some passages from the New Testament to you? And think of this, in light of this principle, eyes are better than ears. Here's from 1 John chapter 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testified to it. And we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. Seems like the author wants to underline some things here. You know, he's repeating it again and again. We saw it, and we heard him speak, and we touched him. We were there. I quoted from Luke by those that he interviewed, those whose from the very first were eyewitnesses. Or think of John. In chapter 19, John, when he tells about the crucifixion and the Lamb of God dying, he says, the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth. So it comes from someone who was there, who saw it. And then he adds this interesting little comment. He knows that he tells the truth. Think of yourself if you have been an eyewitness and you're telling what you have seen. Even if those who listen to you do not believe what you say, you know it's true because you were there. And this is what John is saying. I was there, I saw it. And the testimony is true. And even if you don't believe me, I know it's true. Why? Because I was there. We could have gone on and looked at many other things. I will give you one last thing, which is a very new thing that we have not had much knowledge about earlier. The precision of the information we have in the Gospels. It all began by a Jewish German professor in Berlin, Tal Ilan. She collected all the Jewish names from documents and in inscription from the time before Christ to some time after Christ. And she published what you can call the telephone book from antiquity, making statistics of what were Jewish men named in antiquity. So we now know what's the most popular name and what was very uncommon name. And she made statistics, what were the names in Israel and what were the names among Jewish people in Egypt, where there were a huge Jewish colony. Okay, this is things like scholars like to do. Very boring task, but very good for the rest of us that some people collect this kind of information. Now, onto the scene comes Richard Bauckham, who is a world expert on the New Testament. And he starts to make comparisons with Tal Ilan's telephone book and the Gospels. And he finds some very interesting information. So, the statistics looks like this. Simon was the overall most popular name, male name among Jewish people. It's the all over most popular name. It's the most common name in the New Testament. Most common name within Josephus' writing. Most common name on the ossuaries, which are, what's that in English? Coffins, thank you, bone coffins, where the Jewish people buried the bones of the dead. And it's the second commonest name in the sect of Qumran. Interesting, you have a coherent picture and the New Testament fits into the picture. Joseph was the second most popular name overall. It's the second most popular name in the New Testament. Second most popular Josephus, second most popular at the ossuaries, and the most common name in the sect of Qumran. And you can see in Lazarus was the third, Judas fourth, John fifth. Jesus was the sixth most common name amongst Jewish males. Now if you make some statistics here, you can see the overall picture New Testament fits into what we now know. If you take the first and second place, Simon and Joseph, in Israel 15.16% of the men was called Simon and Joseph. In the Gospel and Acts, it's 18.2% of the men who is called Simon and Joseph. It fits perfectly. If you take the top 9 names in Israel, 41.5% had those names. In the Gospel and Acts, it's 40.3% of the named males, Jewish males, that have those 9 names. It fits perfectly. If you compared what people were named in Egypt compared to Israel, you have this picture. In Egypt, the trends were slightly different. So the most popular name was Lazarus, or a version of it, Eliezer. That was the third most common name in Israel. And you have 2 Lazaruses in the Gospels. Second most common name in Egypt was Sabbataios, built on the Sabbath. Very uncommon name in Israel. Place 68. No one in the New Testament has the name Sabbataios. Joseph, third commonest name. Number 2 in Israel. Number 2 in the New Testament. The fourth most common name was Dositeos. Uncommon name in Israel. No one in the New Testament has the name. Fifth, Pappus. Very uncommon name in Israel. Place number 39. No one in the New Testament has the name Pappus. It fits on every level, the knowledge we now have about name and what we can read in the New Testament. It becomes even more interesting, I think, when we study Matthew and where Jesus is calling his 12 disciples. Have you noticed when it comes to the women in the Gospels that they all have the same name? Namely, Maria, Mary. They are not very creative, the parents in Israel, in naming their daughters. Everyone, not really, but so many are called Mary, it's hopeless. And naturally, because it was such a common name, you couldn't say just, tell something about Mary. You need to identify which Mary. And you can see that in the New Testament. So it's Mary Magdalene. That Mary who was born or comes from the village Magdala. Or Mary, the Lord's mother, Jesus' mother. Or Mary, who was married to, and then you have her husband's name. Or Mary, who was the mother of, and then you have the name of her children. It's like in a class at school. If you have 2 or 3 with the same name, you have to have a nickname to distinguish between. It's naturally. Now, take a look here. You will have the 12 disciples, and you will have a figure where their name is on the 99 list of the most popular name in Israel. If there is no figure after the name, it's not even on the 99 list. Simon, most popular name in Israel. A nickname, who is called Peter. And Andreas, very uncommon name, no nickname. James, Jacob, James, quite common name. Son of Zebedee, identified in relationship to his father. And his brother John, very common name, number 5, and he also is identified to his father. He's one of the sons of Zebedee. Philip, very uncommon name, place number 61, no nickname. But I don't know how you say that in English. Bartholomeus in Swedish. Very uncommon name, place number 50, no nickname. Thomas, very uncommon name, not even on the 99 list. And Matthew, common name, place number 9, identified by his vocation, the tax collector. James, again, common name, place number 11, identified by his father, son of Alphaeus. And Thaddeus, uncommon name, place number 39, no nickname. Simon, again, the most popular name in Israel. The Zealot, or I think at least in Swedish, he's called Kananaios. Identified. So he had a nickname because it's such a common name. And Judas, place number 4, very common name. A nickname, Judas Iscariot. You say it fits perfectly into the new knowledge we now have about the names in Israel. Imagine yourself writing a story about something in Poland 30 years ago. Would you get the names right about people in Poland? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't know which were popular and uncommon names. Would you give the right person nicknames if you were just putting together a story? No, you wouldn't. The only explanation why the Gospels have this kind of precision in how they use names is that they are telling a true story. They are telling a story about real persons. And then all the information will, of course, just fit into the picture, because it's a true story. And this is what this shows us. When we study the Gospels, we are in contact with real history. We are drawn back to the 30s, to the historical person Jesus, his disciples, and real events in Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Thank you so much for listening for a full hour. We could have said much more, but I will stop here. I've given you some of the positive evidences for the reliability of the Gospels. Do we have time for questions now, or is yeah? Okay.
Så hvis der er nogle spørgsmål, så eller kommentarer, så velkommen til at byde ind. Og man kan bare tale dansk eller svensk, fordi Stefan er bedre til at forstå dansk, end dansk er til at forstå svensk. Så værsgo.
Ja, jeg er lige et spørgsmål. Hur lång tid sträcker sig hennes forskning om namn? Hvis det er en lang tid, så kan det bare være det samme i populært 30 år efter. Altså om jeg skriver en historia i Sverige nu, så kanske jag använder de namn som är populära nu. Men det kan vara samma som för 30 år sedan. Alltså om hon har gjort forskning över 200 år, vilket som är populärast. Så jag vet inte, förstår du frågan?
Ja, det var ju på svenska, så att det vore ju illa om jag inte hade gjort det. So it's a question about Tal Ilan's research on the names and the time frame of her research. If it's just for a very limited time, or if it's on a broader scale. It is on a broader scale, so it's both for a time before Jesus and after Jesus. And it's impossible to have a very specific going down. You know, we have information in Sweden. What's the most popular name? 2012, 2013, and it changes. But that's impossible because a lot of names that are given in ancient sources, we cannot date them with that kind of precision. And we can also assume that the trends were not changing that fast in antiquity, but it was a much more it was a more fixed or stable tradition what was popular names. Our name giving changed a lot through media, that some people become famous, and then a lot of parents wants to give their name because a king or a queen or a artist or a football player are having that name, and then that name become very popular suddenly, and then it drops quite quickly.
And that's what I think, that's my point, that it's not that good an evidence because, well, anyone who lived 30 years after Jesus died would have taken the same names he would just take the names of that period, and that would be it. So it's not like, yeah, it's an argument, but it's not that good.
Yeah, I see. And at the same time, you can see that there was also differences in different groups. So the Jewish population in Egypt had very different names. And the Gospels are generally thought to have been written outside Israel. So the Gospel of Mark is written in Rome, and the Gospel of John there are some arguments for it's being written in Ephesus. Some scholars think that Matthew is written in Syria. So they are not actually written in Israel, but they are written in other places with different name culture.